Okay, let's call the meeting to order. We'll do the roll call, please.
San Mateo County,
Fine.
Atherton,
Ready to go in.
Belmont, Julia Mapes, Brisbane, Pauline Mackin, Burlingame, Donna Colton, East Colliton, Melbourne,
And it's fine.
Sanford,
Leave it in.
Sequoia,
Step off. Okay, is there any public comment? See public comment online. I don't see it in the room. So we will move on and I get an action to set the agenda. Second. And all in favor, we don't have anybody in line voting, right? So all in favor. Aye. Okay, the next item on the agenda is the chair report. The only thing that I have to report is, as you all know, at the last board meeting, we agreed to set up a ad hoc committee to discuss the issue of how to use the excess funds within PCE. And I asked board members to let me know if they wanted to be on the committee. And I have a committee of 6 members, and then I have an issue I need to discuss. And the committee would be myself and Donna, and then Marty, Medina, Betsy Nash, Tiger, and Paul Lananis. And I'm not sure if Tiger can do it, but I think it's important that somebody from the coast side be on the committee. He works full time, so we'll see. If he can't do it, then we'll talk to somebody else on the coast side that's on the board to see if they can represent it. But that gives us really good representation from north and south and from the Central Valley. So I feel happy about that. The issue came up at the CAC because it would be valuable to have a CAC member on the committee, and the CAC recommended appointment of Stephen Booker to be on the committee. So it would be a 7-member committee, which I think is about the right size for the committee. So I feel really good about that. The issue is that if you have a non-board member on the committee, then it becomes a Brown Act committee. And so I've talked to council about how to structure the committee to avoid what the solution could be. And there's 2 solutions. We could, the CAC could have its own excess funds committee, and we as a board could have our excess funds committee. I don't think that's a desirable solution. I think we really should have one committee. It'll be easier on staff, and there's no reason for CAC to have to put together an entire committee. We all want to discuss this issue. It's a big issue, and we want to discuss it together, and ultimately it's going to come back to the board. The recommendation is that this be a staff-driven committee. So staff will drive the committee and make recommendations. The committee will be able to discuss anything that it wants to discuss, and ideas that aren't recommended by staff can come up from board members, just like that occur in any committee. I think that's the best solution, so that we can have one committee and it won't be subject to the Brown Act. And if anybody has a different perspective on that, you can speak now or you can let me know later. But that's the recommendation, and I think that works. I feel fine about it. And the first issue that the first committee meeting will address, and it probably will go to more than one committee meeting, is what the criteria are that we want to use to assess and you know, that we'll kind of use as a framework in making that decision about how to use excess funds. And I think the issue of focusing on criteria initially and not just sort of going to the solution is exactly the right issue for the committee to focus on. Okay, that's my only report. Yes.
My only addition to that would be also with the idea that the criteria that they're setting up is potentially what we use any time in the future we have these assessments too.
So that.
Yeah.
This is.
And I'm sure that criteria is gonna be rooted in our strategic plan and our goals and objectives that we've discussed, but we're also at somewhat of a new point in our evolution, given the amount of cash that's.
The only clarity for just public record is that this is a subcommittee. And thus it'll be being for just a very limited period of time, and I think you all have talked about, 90 to 100 days, something in that time, which is what we could try. So just for purposes of clarity. Thank you.
Okay, I don't have anything else. CEO report.
Okay, sure. Go to the next slide, please. Resources analyst or specialist, we have brought two on board. One is Shayna and another is starting soon. But we have one more our resources analyst we want to add to our resources team. We have two positions open in our account services area. One is an account services specialist, basically to backfill behind Shayna, who moved over to our resources, and then a senior analyst for account services. And then we're looking for a senior manager of local power development. And so basically this person will be leading the work on our solar plus storage on public buildings. So this person would report into Raphael. Raphael's been leading it. And so this is just basically to that senior manager to take some of the burden off of Raphael for that work, since we're doing so many systems. And we're looking for someone who has significant experience doing distributed solar systems, who's familiar with all the tax equity part of it, as well as construction. Basically someone who's probably from the development world who would like to join us would be an ideal person. We are going to be posting a CFO position this week. And that's where we're at right now. So if you know of any great candidates for any of these positions, please send them on. And I think that's all that I have to say. So, Andy,
Jennifer.
Jennifer.
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to clarify on the previous issue of the subcommittee and ad hoc subcommittee. If it is staff-led, it's not governed by the rule of having to have it time limited, et cetera. Although I think that those are great parameters to set for staff. That's all.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Andy, show again.
Next slide. Well, this is really just an FYI for the executive committee. The audit finance committee met this morning and approved a resolution to recommend approval to the full board. But as is our standard, we're just making sure the executive committee members are up to speed on what will be presented to the board in a couple of weeks. A smaller version of the same slides. We met with the audit finance committee and the board last month, and then today with the audit finance committee and with all. And then on June 22nd, approved the final budget. Next slide, please. Revisions since the initial draft that you would have seen at the board, since I don't think this got presented to the executive committee last month. We updated the ending fiscal year 23 or June 23 forecast to reflect April financial results, which we didn't have at the time. We made some minor adjustments to the program's budget. We made some modification to the assumptions of GovPV, which is the solar and storage and a kind of a over-encompassing acronym for storage for municipal buildings as well as on-bill financing. In terms of being conservative a few years out, we made some minor modifications to the days cash on hand to make some corrections. Next slide, please. This I won't go through this. But this was just a reiteration of the same slide that was in the budget, the board doc, which is the key assumptions around revenues and customer rates. And the next slide, please. These are the same key assumptions that were in that budget for cost of energy and the solar and storage on public buildings category. I'll draw its particular attention just to make sure that you're all aware. In the second bullet, there's that overall budget includes 2 conservatism contingencies. The first is $15 million for cost of energy. We did the same thing last year, the same $15 million contingency. So first we go through and make all the assumptions about market prices and apply external sources about market price predictions and costs and cost of RA and all those other things we do. And then we added $15 million last year. It turns out that we used all of that volatility contingency last year because we're still going, the current expectation is it will probably be about $5 million over our budget for energy costs this year when the final year end happens. The other categories of expenses are likely to be close or under, and therefore our total expenses might be the budget. In fact, very close to budget, we predict, but the energy cost, the volatility conservatism was well used. And we built that same $15 million a year into the next 5-year projections. And then there's also Bill came up at the audit finance, so I wanted to draw attention to it. But we've also built in a contingency for the planned 99% 24/7 hourly renewable project to get to by 2027. And that is because, or how that works is there are, I can't remember the number, 13 to 15 contracts that need to be signed between now and that 2027 timeframe on a timeline at prices that we predicted and budgeted. And if we're not able to sign all of any of those contracts, the cost of buying renewable power would be a lot more. In fact, it would be $112 million. So we have built into the 5-year plan an assumption that we might, that it could be as much as 50% of those contracts that we get signed or delayed, or sorry, 50% that we don't get signed, or they get delayed, or the prices are higher than we predict. The impact on the current year budget is very small, so it's only $770,000. A lot of work to do in terms of contracting, and often contracts get delayed. A lot of work that needs to get done over the next couple of years to achieve that objective. Excuse me. Any questions? Okay, next slide. Okay, this one and the next one, because they're more detailed, we'll come back to them with one. This is still relatively hard to read, but it's a summarized version. The peach highlighted line is the what the board will be asked to approve, which is $350.6 million of total operating expenses. A couple of years ago, 3 years ago, we adopted this methodology that instead of the board approving the change in that position or profitability of the organization, the board approved total operating expenses, one total number, instead of approving line item by line item, which meant that some items would be over and some would be under, and then we'd have to come back for approval on the ones that were over, even though we might be under in total. The looking down on the left column, which is the revised draft budget, which is the budget asked to be approved. The revenues are a total of $474 million. Total operating expenses of $350 million. The first highlighted in yellow line is change in that position, which is predicted to be $124 million or budgeted. And then ending cash, $177 million. We've added another line there just for total transparency or more transparency. the total cash before those solar and storage large investments is about 387.5 million. And then an assumption in those programmatic programs of $10.4 million of outflow, and therefore we expect to end cash at the end of fiscal year 24 at 377 million. Be an unrestricted days cash on hand of 393 days. And then you can see over the next 4 years, some larger amounts of cash outflow, especially next year in the fiscal year 25, as we expand the PV program, solar storage into a larger phase, and days cash on hand drops to 326 and then grows again to 464 over the next 4 years after. Prior two slides have a lot more detail if you have any questions, but I'll pause there for any questions. Again, board, this committee is not being asked for approval. It's really just an FYI, but unless you have any questions, then we can move on to the next slide.
I just have one comment. And this is made with Stephen, and his request to just add a comment from the CAC meeting on Thursday night, which reads, it's regarding item 4 budget reported update. It reads, the CAC appreciates the significant work that went into developing a budget and the budget details that were shared with us. We support the creation of an ad hoc subcommittee, including a CAC member. In order to continue to advise on the potential uses of excess funds, specifically focused on programmatic funding moving forward.
Any comments or questions? Right. I think this is not an action for us. Okay. On to the next item. The next item, I believe, is an update to the strategic priority to
So Mehdi will be making this presentation. So as you know, our strategic plan, it's to deliver 100% renewable by 2025 on a 99% time coincident basis by 2025. So that was what we reviewed at the board meeting in September. And what we are talking about today is pushing out till 27 time coincident. Mehdi, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear my voice?
Yes.
yeah.
Okay. So I'm Mehdi Shariari, Manager of Planning and Analytics in the Power Resources team. And as Jan mentioned, today I'm going to provide an update on our strategic priority regarding our 24/7 renewable goal. Next slide, please. I will start with like a background on our 24/7 goal and the challenges we have been facing with meeting this goal in 2025. And then I will talk about why we think there are some benefits in shifting our target date to 2027. Next slide, please. So as you remember, back in November of last year, Board of Directors adopted staff's recommendation on delivering 100% renewable energy annually on a 99% time coincident basis by 2025. This recommendation was based on the mid-2022 market condition. The results of this analysis that was performed by staff last year was published in a white paper in January of this year. And next slide, please. So since we adopted this goal, staff have diligently been working on finding resources that would help us meet this goal in 2025. As like to provide like a little bit of background, you can see the graph in here. So this is like part of our analysis we did last year, is included in the white paper. We showed that to move from our current portfolio to a 99% time coincident portfolio, we need like significant procurement of around like 600 to 800 megawatt of additional capacity. And a big part of this additional capacity needs to come from onshore wind or geothermal. And since then, we have been like running some RFOs. We have been like doing bilateral reach outs to different counterparties to find these kind of resources. But we have been facing like several challenges. And the main challenge we have faced is basically there have been delays in development of resources, which means that fewer resources are available to PCE by 2025. There are like different reasons for these like delays, global supply chain disruptions, labor shortage, financing costs have been increasing, and also like CAISO interconnection delays have basically resulted in like delay in COD of different projects. We have been also looking to find like short-term contracts with existing renewable resources, but we haven't been able to find such resources. Basically, in a summary, achieving this goal in 2025, given the limited resources that are expected to be available online, would be infeasible. Next slide. So in the last few months, staff has been working on updating our 24/7 modeling. We have been using the information from like several RFOs that we have already ran this year. We have done bilateral reach out to counterparties, and our focus have been on studying the possibility of achieving the 24/7 goal by 2027, when more resources would be available to PCE. Some of the potential resources that could be available in 2027 are out-of-state wind, such as wind from New Mexico and Wyoming. There are opportunities to find like new geothermal or shaped or firm renewables, and we could find like lower cost storage as well. Next slide, please. And we believe like shifting this goal in 2027 from 2025, there are like some benefits, as I mentioned, like, and there will be like a more diverse set of resources. So we can basically build a more optimal resource portfolio. And there is opportunity to avoid excessive over procurement. And also we can work on reducing the cost and risk of our portfolio in the long term. And next slide. As a result, staff is intending to bring this recommendation to the Board of Directors next Thursday to basically update Peninsula Clean Energy's strategic plan priority to deliver 100% renewable energy annually by 2025, but shift the target date for the 99% time coincident from 2025 to 2027. So this is this like a brief presentation on our 24/7 goal. And at this time, I would like to welcome in any input or feedback.
William.
I think in general, I understand why it's important to maintain acreage base 25 goal and to extend the goal. I guess it just would like to make a little more detail on why we think 2027 is a reasonable goal as opposed to I just my preference is to set reasonable goals, and new 2025 was a pretty it was going to be a challenge, but be sure that 2027 is extending out. Maybe just explain kind of how you got it, please.
Yeah, basically, we have been looking at, like, as I mentioned, like we have running like several RFOs. We have been like doing like bilateral reach out to different counterparties. And this is like based on like looking at like when these like different projects could become available to PCE based on the analysis and the start date of like these different projects, like out of state wind or geothermal. That's why I think like the 2027 would be a more appropriate target date compared to 2025.
So me then, Donna, let me give, so when I think about this, there are, and this is just my individual perspective, so I'm not representing anybody but myself here. But I think of three different variables that are really important. One is whether the power is 100% carbon free versus renewable. And obviously there's some additional expense for it to qualify in the state of California as renewable. Two is whether we achieve 100% clean power or we agree to achieve some lesser percentage of clean power. And we've already had that discussion targeting 99%, but we could look at a different percentage than that if we wanted to. That's the second variable. And the third variable is the issue of being time coincident. That is defining our power as clean the way the CPUC defines it, which is on an annual basis, versus the way we are attempting to get LSCs to look at it, which is to look at every hour and therefore 24/7. And from my perspective, the most important issue in that mix is that the power be entirely non-carbon or 100% carbon free. And we know that's a challenge because we know the power that is available at night is system power and it's not clean. So I think of all three of those things, it's most important for me, for us to address the issue we addressed in our white paper about annual clean power versus 24/7 clean power, and to make sure that power is carbon free. I know that there's a lot of cost involved in making it renewable versus carbon free. I'd like to understand what that different cost is, because I may not care. I mean, I think it's good to be renewable, but not if it costs $56 million to be renewable versus to be carbon free. I'd also like to understand what the cost is if we're not just looking at renewable, but we're looking at carbon free to have it be 100% versus 99% versus 98%. I think the more the better, but it's a cost benefit balance that we have to analyze. And the third issue deals with the time coincident. I think us raising the time coincident, which we really took a strong position on, and I think it's jolted the industry, and that's the right thing to do. I feel proud that we've done that. But I think we need to understand what the cost is of that. And we decided to go to 99%. We decided to keep the time coincident analysis, which I think is good. I'd like to keep it. But I'd like to understand those three variables in the cost, which I know is pretty complicated. But I think in assessing this, that's most important to me. And Julia's comment is, well, why 2027 versus 2028 or 2029? That's a relevant and valid comment. But I need to put in the context, well, how does it change if we're looking at not renewable, but 100% carbon free power? Donna.
So 100% agree with you on that, and Julia, on your comment too. And then I would even layer in the sort of multiplier effect of us going out and marketing to other CCAs, this 24/7 concept, because obviously what happens then is if we're competing for those very scarce resources and we've convinced everybody else, now we're all competing for battery storage, battery backup, there becomes a multiplier effect on demand while supply is fairly stagnant, which could potentially drive up time costs, drive out time and drive up cost. So the complexity of the market, as Chair William points out,
is not just, we're not operating in a vacuum by ourselves. We're operating in an ecosystem that has a lot of multifaceted and multifunctioning parts. And how our teammates move can drive resources and so, and I mean, you know, frankly, you know, when you go to some of these conferences, you talk to people, they're a little worried about us, I mean, leading the way on this, because they're worried that, you know, it's going to have an impact on distorting, I think, market making flow. I don't understand enough about it, Jan, you didn't think about it more, but I think those things will complicate Rick's analysis and potentially push the timing out beyond 7. And to Julia's point, do we want to continue to have missed benchmarks, or do we want it to be more realistic ones that we can then meet comfortably?
Jeff?
My 2 responses to those 3 comments are, I mean, the first is that time coincidence, being time coincident actually becomes a cost savings long. By the more resilient we make our power supply, we actually avoid a lot of market volatility. And we realize significant savings by getting, the closer we get to 100% time coincidence, we actually realize savings versus just an annual renewable. And the other is that, you know, we will spur demand, but by going out and proselytizing, or, you know, for time coincidence, we're also sending a market signal. And markets do work. They don't always work perfectly, but they do work, and they should respond. And, you know, we had a comment earlier in audit of finance about the fact that there's an economy of scale here, and that the broader and larger market signal we send, the more people we hopefully spur into developing the world and developing these new sort of, but currently expensive sources of energy. So, yeah, well, there'll be more demand, but the market should respond by, in theory, they almost always respond by creating more supply and demand. So it's yeah, there's a short-term risk, but I also think that it's frankly, it's necessary to achieve our societal goals of 20% time.
Don?
But I agree, Jeff, but I think when you overlay supply chain disruption, labor shortages, rising financing costs, and interconnection delays, those are things beyond our control to some degree. And, you know, I'll give you a perfect example, big heavy industry trucks that are needed to build all this stuff. My brother builds huge infrastructure projects, and he told me they're getting trucks 99% built, and a tiny little either chip or a little hose for one little thing that they need, playing the actual onlining of these huge giant trucks they need to build all this stuff by 2 years. And that is beyond, I mean, you're operating in a very hypothetical world. This is the world of reality, which I think Mehdi just pointed out, which is all these disruptions. So I guess we could set goals that say, if we have no global supply chain disruptions, if there's no world labor shortage, if we can get financing costs stay low, and we can get interconnection, we could make this goal. But all these extraneous market factors is what I'm
saying that the added demand actually puts more pressure on the market. So, I mean, it's not hypothetical, it's long term. I realize I don't think it's a long term. But long term generally happens. But also, the 10% goal is not a hit or miss goal. I mean, being 78% time coincident by 2027 is actually a good thing for us, because it's eliminating a lot of the market. So, I would like to stay aggressive on this, with the understanding that, again, 78% isn't meeting our goal, but it's not a loss. The further we get along that timeline, even if it's not perfect, it's still.
Well, I'd say of those 3 variables, I think the time coincident variable is the most important. But what I'd like to do, so the proposal here is go to time coincident, push it out until 2027 because we can't get the renewable power to satisfy it. Well, but can we get carbon-free power to satisfy it? I'd rather be time coincident sooner than 2027 and not worry so much about renewable. I think that, and I recognize what you say, that being time coincident in the long term is actually gonna reduce our power costs. And I think it's gonna reduce our power costs because of what we put in place, not just based on market signal. There's gonna be what we put in place for our power needs that in the long run, and I think it was surprising to all of us when we saw the analysis from the staff that actually it was much closer than we expected. And I think that's because it does reduce it. So I like, of the three variables, to me, I don't want to tie being time coincident into being renewable. I want to achieve the time coincident, as soon as we can practically do so. I want to see what the costs are.
When you say the difference between carbon free and renewable, what's an example?
Well, the best example is large hydro coming from the northwest. And,
Let me respond to that. So part of being time coincident is that we need to be able to schedule our power to get it when we need it. Large hydro, we cannot schedule that. It comes when it comes. When we do the agreements with the suppliers, they cannot guarantee that they are going to deliver 100 megawatt hours at this time. They're just going to deliver us a bulk amount and we'll get it when we get it. So it's difficult to achieve time coincidence if it's just clean. Additionally, from PG&E, we get the free hydro from PG&E. They tell us 5 months afterwards when it was delivered and how much was delivered. Obviously, they know, but they tell us 5 months after the fact what we actually got. So that provides a real challenge when we want to add hydro to the mix, which is why we've been focusing on renewable, because we can contract for it, we know exactly what the schedule is going to be, and we can meet it. If I can respond to the question about why 27 instead of 25. So there's a PPA that hopefully we are going to be bringing to the board next week. A wind project in New Mexico. And initially that project was going to start operations in 2025. And now it's been pushed out to 27, which is why we're actually pushing this to 27. And that's one of the key parts of the strategy. So, and I think we're pretty confident that they're going to make that date. If that changes again, then, staff will come back to you and push the date out, but that's
So-
really the date
So this
change.
may just expose my ignorance, but so the large hydro in the Pacific Northwest, is it that we can't schedule it because we don't buy it under a PPA? We buy it on the market basically, or
Well, we buy it
subject to-
full. Yeah, I mean, we buy GHG3, so we buy the GHG3 attributes, but they don't schedule the power to be delivered to us at a certain time.
And is that because if it were on a PPA, we could get it delivered at a certain time?
Possibly, that's not the way that transacts. And then for large hydro within the state, the
Well,
IOUs are the owners of that, so
Right,
we don't
that's a
have,
different
we
deal.
don't have access to that. So we can't get it scheduled the day and the time that we want. It seems like
So-
we should be able to.
Yeah, my question is, well,
We can't.
have we attempted to buy, if either of those power supplies on a PPA and therefore get it on delivered when we want it? Not just the attributes, but the power.
We can ask them. I think imports into the state are a little more tricky.
Well, we're buying New Mexico power or Wyoming wind power on a PPA and getting it delivered at time.
They're building a transmission line to interconnect with the ISO, and there's a lot of complications, but we get certain allocation of when we can bring power in through the state. Mehdi could get into a lot more detail on this, which I don't, which we're happy to do if you'd like. But the renewables are scheduled in a different way than the GHG3 is.
Including geothermal too.
geothermal is renewable, so geothermal is like wind and solar, so we do have those scheduled, yeah, it's just the geothermal is renewable, the only clean power is the large hydro.
So you're saying we have to use renewable to meet the track this year? Federal challenge.
Yeah, pretty much, unless we were able to contract directly for output from a large hydro facility, and we're unable to do that. So
But if we tried to do that,
I don't know that we've tried, we could check, I think there's some, I don't know,
I
maybe.
think it would be in their economic interest to do
Yeah.
it. Even if
Maybe
you're,
Betty or Roy can respond as to whether Roy, if you've had any experience contracting for large hydro out of state and being able to have it on a PPA and schedule it in your previous lives.
In my previous life and back in Riverside, Riverside in their portfolio has the Hoover Power Plant, actually is a federally owned project. And allocation of the Hoover project was agreed upon decades ago through an allocation process. It was not done through a PPA. Every off-taker has a percentage share of the offtake rights, and it is secondary to. So the priority of the Hoover Dam is you have to meet water use, agriculture use, and power generation is the third on the line. So and every month Riverside would receive a monthly schedule depending on the water level of the lake. And then depending on that, you get allocation based on a percentage of your contract to offtake the power. So it is not as reliable to meet a hourly matching goal as say a geothermal resource, which is a base load, and a base load that has a very high capacity factor. Hydro resources tend to vary depending on the water conditions and other operating parameters they have to follow. That might take precedent over power generation. So yeah, so I don't think we as staff have reached out to any out-of-state large hydro resources to seek a PPA structure, but we could certainly reach out and see if there's any interest in the market to do that.
Thank you, Roy.
yeah, I'm just thinking, you would think from an economic perspective, but that even PG&E, if they've got excess power, some of which comes from their large hydro facilities, that they would be willing at a price, obviously, to sell that power and deliver it.
But like he's saying with, I know it's true with the Hoover Dam, but I think it's also true to some extent with Bonneville Power, which is the Washington hydro, which is electricity is not their top priority. Their top priority is water for basically farming. And so it's like if they have to let a certain amount of water out a certain day when we don't get electricity, that electricity goes out whether we want it or not. And so it's sort of, and I think it's just an archaic kind of contract structure where they don't want to afford to schedule a hour, they just want to release it when they need to release water. It's kind of 1960s sort of technology and economics meeting 2020's demands.
Yeah, plus there's also the fish, they need to have enough water for
Yeah.
salmon runs and
And it
things like
rains
that.
and all.
But yeah, well, I don't know what the price would be.
Yeah, no, it may not be
Not,
worth pursuing, but
yeah. I mean, certainly right now, solar with storage is the cheapest, so.
Doc,
When will we be, so when's our goal, I need to take out eco? Is it eco 100?
Yeah, we're talking about that internally. So Eco 100 is our 100% renewable product. So we need to have some kind of marketing strategy to transition the product to the 100% renewable. And how do you communicate to that people? How do you educate them on what that means? And so Gwen, our marketing director, is spending a lot of time thinking about that. Yeah.
I think this is an action item.
This isn't an action item. Yeah, this is just to, we are gonna bring this to the board. So the questions that you've asked today are great, so that we can modify the presentation to be clear when we bring it to the board, which will be an action.
Any other comments? Let me just make sure there's no public comment on this issue. Is there any public comment? If so, now would be a great time to provide it. Don't see any public comment.
I suggest on this slide, I think, Dr. Ops brings up some really, Jeff brings up some really good points, which is, reminding us, like at the bottom, deliver 100% renewable energy on that hand transport to base by 2027. This reduce costs, what are some of the, like, just kinds of the benefits or anything, just so it looks a little more robust when the public's reviewing it.
Okay. Good idea.
Okay. Any other final comments? Okay, don't see any. Next issue is a report on the regionalization of the electricity grid.
So this is, so Jeremy and Mark are going to cover this. I think Jeremy's going to go first. So you don't have to stand up unless you want to. But this is an issue that's basically a study session for you, just to inform you about what the issues are about regionalization, namely about the California ISO expanding its footprint beyond California, what that means, what the pluses and minuses are of that. There happens to be a bill that's addressing this, which may or may not go anywhere. So the focus today is not on that bill, although Mark will talk about that. The focus is really to inform you as to what the key issues are at regionalization, because this is something that the state is going to have to address in the next 1 to 3 years, I would say. So, Jeremy, go ahead.
Hello, members of the board. Hopefully you can hear me all right. As Jen said,
Actually,
this is
everyone is left. Jeremy, hold on a second. A number of people have left the room, so let's wait until they come back.
okay.
So, I'm not sure. I think it was
So-
comfort for you, but yeah, let's hold on for about 2 minutes.
Here you go. While we're waiting, just wasn't 538 made into a 2-year bill? I mean, I know it would come.
Yeah. Not quite what we want it to be, but.
It's a little hard on my end to tell just how many are in the room with the owl moving around constantly. So just let me know when it's the right time to start.
Yeah, let's see, we're waiting for the papers to get back. That's it, we didn't want you to miss that, so we wanted that. Thank you.
Just waiting for him.
I'd say let's go ahead.
Okay, good. Take it away, Jeremy, thank you.
No problem. So good morning, members of the board. As Jan was just explaining, this is really a presentation intended to be a bit of a primer on this issue area of grid regionalization. And the context of it, the technical context of it, and then a bit of the political context is where it sits. And if there's anything I hope you take away from this, is that this is a very technically, politically, and procedurally complicated issue, but it's an important one. So let's move on to the next slide. And as I was just saying, this issue is being explored by the California legislature. It's something that the California Independent System Operator, the ISO, has been open to exploring in recent years, and it is raising some very significant and very high level policy questions for the state, for the broader context than just the state of California, but it's being contemplated within our legislature. So we're really focusing on it through our state's view. And as we'll get into a little bit further, key stakeholders are really divided on the merits of regionalization. And we'll get into a bit of the why and who later in this presentation, but it's I think important to highlight that there's definitely not a clear consensus view one way or the other. But I do think this is a very timely and important matter for us as a state to be contemplating. And we definitely want to open it up to your input as well, your impressions. We know just through the CCA grapevine that some boards and other CCAs have been hearing a bit about this matter from various members of the public and interest groups. And so part of this is to see if you all have been hearing much about this from your constituents and such. Next slide. So at a high level, the United States operates its electricity grids and its electricity service through really three distinct independent grids: the Eastern Interconnection, the Western Interconnection, and Texas. And quite obviously, we are part of the Western Interconnection, the WEC, as it's commonly referred to. And so this regionalization conversation is focused just on the WEC area and the WEC footprint. I would highlight that the WEC does include a bit of Western Canada as well as Western United States. Next slide. And so within the WEC, there are quite a few different balancing authorities. And often our conversations are really focused on our immediate community, PG&E's footprint, or perhaps when we get to a larger scale, the ISO footprint. But I think it's important to appreciate that the California ISO, while it is a large operator, is one of many in the broader Western footprint. And all of these balancing authorities are subject to federal oversight. So they report both to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, and the North America Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC. And that's important context for some of the later details that we'll discuss. You can move on to the next slide. So the California Independent System Operator, as it presently sits today, is both a balancing authority, which manages the supply and demand of electricity within their footprint, makes sure that there's enough supply to meet demand, as well as a regional transmission operator. And that is a critical detail that really comes from the origins of the ISO in the aftermath of the California energy crisis, where private operation of transmission lines was a contributing factor to that crisis. And the formation of the ISO was motivated highly to prevent another such crisis of market manipulation. So ISO operates in both camps there, optimizing the operation of the transmission grid as well as balancing the overall supply and demand flow within its footprint. And the ISO does report to FERC and NERC in their roles, and anytime there is a policy reform being contemplated at the ISO, it ultimately does have to bubble up back to federal review and approval, usually through FERC oversight. And unlike other RTOs, and this is a very important detail to highlight in the context of regionalization, the Board of Governors for the California Independent System Operator, they're all appointed by the California governor and confirmed by the state Senate. And so it's a bit of a unique entity in that it is squarely within at least the leadership of the organization is squarely within the state's control and political control. Though, as I mentioned before, it does have to interact with federal oversight in its operations.
But Jeremy, can you comment about how that is different from other RTOs?
Thank you.
Yeah, often other RTOs have a broader footprint across multiple states, and as such, their governance bodies have to include representation beyond a single state's direct control. And that is an important detail that needs to be, what we will discuss, needs to be contemplated in this regionalization context. The structure of governance for a regionalized operation that includes California would have very clear changes to how much control California has over the governing body of that entity. And then just quickly, the ISO does have a couple of markets that extend beyond its immediate footprint. They have the Western Energy Imbalance Market and the Extended Day Ahead Market. And these are both markets for transacting energy supply. The difference between the two is one is a real-time market where the other is a day-ahead market. And these were really brought about through insistence from stakeholders that and interest from the ISO staff as a whole, that there could be greater efficiencies with economies of scale and geographic diversity as well. So for example, the WECC extends all the way eastward to the eastern border of Colorado. The sun sets much earlier in Colorado than it does here in California. And as I think we're all aware, we have a large amount of solar generation in the afternoon hours that is generally more than is needed here in California, which provides a prime opportunity for us to be exporting that power, selling that to more eastern states during their evening hours to help address their evening ramps. So it's an example of just broader economic efficiency by allowing energy to flow and transact over a broader footprint. And these two models of both the real-time market and the day-ahead scheduling market have proven to be generally very good successes and very good economic successes, which is part of what's helped to further pique interest in broader, more comprehensive regionalization efforts with ISO. I think we can move on to the next slide. And for a little bit of further context, as we all know, California has very ambitious clean energy objectives. And to meet those objectives, we need to be building a tremendous amount of additional generation capacity. And where that can be cited, both in terms of geography, environmental considerations, as well as in the context of existing transmission infrastructure. These are very challenging issues that the state and outside the state folks are exploring to figure out how we can optimize that. This little graphic on the side highlights just how much California consumes, how much more energy California consumes and generates at present, to emphasize just how much we rely on the import of power. As the conversation earlier was noting, the reliance on Pacific Northwest hydroelectric power is significant in California. We also import some power from some of our neighboring states down in the south and the east. And as we're all well aware with the summer reliability concerns we've had over the last several years and leading into this year as well, during absolute peak periods of the year, peak demand, we do end up having to lean quite a bit on importing electricity from out of state to meet those peak demands. And so we're already part of a broader footprint than just California. We're not operating purely as California as an island grid and as an island self-supplying industry here. So we're already relying on our neighbors to a high degree. We know we need to be expanding tremendously with another 86 gigawatts of generation capacity. And there's very real questions around how that should be done, where that should be done. Should all 86 of those gigawatts be in state? Should we be looking at a broader footprint to source those 86 gigawatts? And what would that mean in terms of economics, politics, job creation, et cetera? I think there's one more slide that I wanted to cover before pausing for questions. Can we advance? Thank you. And this is I think some of the latest consideration, which is what's helping to make regionalization become much more of an urgent conversation within California, is that there is another RTO that comes from the Southwest Power Pool, sorry. And they too are offering markets to other market participants that extend beyond their immediate footprint, including the Markets Plus platform, which is a bit of a competitive alternative to the Western Energy Imbalance Market and the extended day ahead that the ISO offers. And as this market is growing, there is this kind of competition to see who amongst the generators, amongst the, say, the hydro fleet operators, who participates in which markets. And to participate in one or the other, you're precluded from participating. You can't play in both markets at the same time effectively. So there's this competition that's arising between where the supply is going to be made available and through which markets. And there's a bit of a concern, kind of put plainly, that this broader market may be eating California's lunch, as we have historically depended upon a lot of import power, as I noted already, and as the suppliers of that import power in the past are now looking to participate in this other market, we may be seeing less and less capacity being made available to California without some consideration for a broader regional optimization of those markets. So I wanted to pause here. This is a lot of information, a lot of new acronyms, a lot of different contexts than we typically focus on, just to see if there are any questions in the room. And
Just a quick question. So the resources will be less and less available, fewer and fewer resources will be available to California. Is that because the other states also have their generation goals? And so they'll be keeping their clean energy? No, I guess I want to understand that.
yeah, other states do have their own climate objectives. They do have their own just general procurement and reliability objectives. They may be more motivated by load growth, growing urban areas and not having enough supply within their own states and portfolios. There's definitely there's also the formation of a new, so here in California, we have the Resource Adequacy Program, which is a way of ensuring that we have adequate generation capacity to meet demand in the highest hours. That model has been somewhat unique in context, but now there are RA-like models starting to shape up in other states, which are requiring those states to contemplate having greater assurances about the resources being available to meet their demand throughout the highest hours of their days. So there's kind of a growing, I guess, market or appetite for securing resources from other states, from other regions, to ensure the reliable operation of electricity and across other states and other markets. And so I guess it's part of it is, as I understand, is that the growing sophistication of our neighbors, our neighboring states and their neighboring markets is creating a bit more competition for California. That is, say the appeal of the Northwest Hydro that we have relied on heavily during summer peak. Well, that's now becoming more widely appealing as heat waves are becoming more of a significant factor over a larger geography. So don't know if that quite clearly answers your question, but there's growing appetite, there's growing demand in the broader footprint. And since they have these two different markets and they're requiring suppliers to operate in one or the other, it's creating a additional constraint of supply by having to divide up those markets.
Yeah, Colleen.
Jeremy, has there been any thought or studies as to whether California's power consumption importation will actually increase or stabilize in the next 5 to 10 years?
Good question. There are a lot of studies out there around California's growing demand for electricity, and it does depend. Well, there are certainly some key drivers increasing our demand for power, as we are well aware in our organization. The push to electrify transportation, electrify buildings is certainly growing demand for our state. And there are some very real questions about how that's done and how optimally that's done. If we are not contributing to our peak demand and peak hours, then there may be more adequate supply or a lower cost supply of electricity to, say, charge cars when it's not during peak. not just peak within the day, but peak within the seasons of the year. So to kind of more directly answer your question, there's a range of studies, a range of projections out there of just how much California electricity demand will grow, but it'll certainly grow if we are successful with our efforts to reduce our use of methane gas and switch, and gasoline as well, and switch those sectors over to electrification.
And a second part of that would be, wouldn't we be under potentially more constraints to import power as a lot of those western states have experienced population growth in the last 5 years because they're kind of Sunbelt states?
Yeah, I definitely think a reliance on imports is not diminishing, it's growing. And that happening, our demand for imports growing at the same time that supply for imports may be dwindling is definitely a challenging reality to be part of. To answer the prior question as well in a little more context, California keeps making the rules, and California, in particularly the Public Utilities Commission, keeps making the rules for importing power. They keep increasing the complexity that the suppliers have to meet, or that we, the purchasers of that power, have to meet through our contracts to ensure that that power is actually going to flow in the hours when it's needed most. And I think part of what we're seeing is as California's regulations get more and more complicated, it's motivating suppliers in other states to look elsewhere, to simpler markets with lower regulatory risk and uncertainty. And so that's part of why we're seeing a diminished amount of import capacity in just this last year and in the present year. And that feeds into your question as well, that there's, I think, a growing demand while there's a tightening supply, not just due to market competition, but also growing regulatory uncertainty and increased regulatory risk.
Jeremy, I have a question on the image that's on the screen right now. This is a little hard for me to see because I'm across the room, but it identifies the Southwest Power Pool. And given the color, is the Southwest Power Pool the states from the Dakotas down into the northern part of Texas? And I don't know what the different colors in the other states mean, but you said that this is a competitive offering to the regionalization concept. So is there some idea that those states from whatever it is, the Dakotas down through the northern part of Texas would be seeking to regionalize some of the states that would otherwise be in the regional entity that is contemplated in the West?
So I am not fully versed in the full footprint and service area of the Southwest Power Pool, but my understanding from the conversations we've been having around regionalization is that they are trying to draw more and more market participants from the more Western states. So where you're seeing the blue and you're seeing the orange develop. So there's their Market Plus program, which I spoke to earlier. There's also then in the kind of peach color, the RA market that they're creating, the Western Regional Resource Adequacy Program, or RAP is what is commonly being referred to. And so they're trying to highlight the geography of where the market participants are that are committing to these markets. And for California's sake, it's really those neighboring states that we tend to rely on pretty heavily for our imports that are creating a lot of the concern around kind of the loss of supply that may be occurring. I don't know if that quite answers your question, Rick. I'm happy to follow up with some more details on the Southwest Power Pool later.
But Jeremy, the concern here though is that it effectively islands us in a way, correct? If Southwest Power Pool continues to pick up new RTO participants, it reduces our ability to have counterparties in other states potentially. That's sort of the heart of the issue, right?
Yes, that's the heart of the issue. If we aren't proactive in regionalization, we may find ourselves, even if we don't deliberately choose it, becoming a bit of an island where we as a state really truly have to supply all electricity that our state consumes in all hours of the day. And that we can even lead into the next slide here now. That's a good bridge of weighing some of the pros and cons for regionalization. That's a major factor. So with a broader regional footprint, there's an opportunity for greater reliability. There's the chance to accelerate how we decarbonize, improving the market for solar and wind that's being generated in other geographies. It might have, as I was explaining earlier with the Colorado example and California solar, some temporal values that can be improved on. Improving how we manage our transmission planning. There's going to be a lot of new transmission built, and it would be a shame if that was not done in the most optimal way. If the ISO, California ISO, is planning its transmission routes, and the other transmission planning entities outside of California are planning their routes, and they don't quite line up, that can result in many more costs ultimately for our ratepayers, especially if we are needing to build transmission that extends across the California border to enable the supply of electricity from resources elsewhere. And the greater operational oversight can allow for better use of that transmission infrastructure, the streamlining of costs relating to our RA programs and operating reserves, just general economic efficiencies that come with the scale. And a bit of that we've been able to see already from those regional markets that the ISO has been offering in the day ahead and the day of. So it's largely arguments about heightened reliability at lower costs and the potential to accelerate meeting our climate objectives through having a larger footprint. And if you move to the next slide. So this is a list of many of the supporters of the regionalization effort. I won't read all of them here, but it gives you kind of a range of the flavor that's out there. Certain environmental groups are supportive, certain large ones like NRDC and EDF. Certainly quite a few representatives of the business sector are supportive of it. Big names like Microsoft have come out in support of this effort. And in the power sector, first and foremost, I'd highlight that the ISO is supportive of this. If they were not, this would be a moot conversation, I think. But then many other key players in the industry. And I would like to highlight that MCE has been supportive of regionalization, not just with this current legislative cycle, but the last time this came up in the legislature as well. So there's been a vocal supporter from the CCA community that's believed that this is the way that we as the broader state need to be heading. And numerous other key generators in the independent energy producers, so trade groups and such, California Edison as well. So quite a few within the business that seem to think that this is the way we need to be headed. We can move to the next slide, which is that there are certainly valid arguments against regionalization as well. And we foreshadowed this a bit already in the conversation, which is that currently California has control of the board at the ISO. If the ISO were to regionalize, then California would only have control over one seat within that board, at least as presently contemplated. And there would need to be some degree of balancing the votes, perhaps by load share or such, to enable that governing body to function. But that would be a big change in terms of the degree of influence that California would have over the entity as a whole. And this is an area where many have been waiting for the governor's office to weigh in with some further insight or guidance for how they might see this working. And to date, and Mark can provide a little update further at the end here, but my impression is we've not heard anything concrete come out of the governor's office as to how the actual governance structure of regionalized ISO would work. It then does create a risk for broader federal oversight, and there's always this push-pull between what California wants to do and what the broader federal conversation around the energy industry thinks ought to happen. California has been historically far more progressive in terms of addressing its climate objectives and realizing the perils of climate change ahead of the rest of the country. And so there's very real fears, I think, of this perhaps hindering some of California's ability to innovate and act ahead of the curve in these areas if we are then tied into a regionalized effort that has to weigh and balance the interests of multiple states across the WEC. There's very real labor concerns around regionalization, especially around organized labor here in California, and you'll see a bit of that on the next slide, but there's very real concerns about job loss over the state border if a regionalized effort occurs. And then, well, on the pro side, we did speak about how this could accelerate the achievement of our climate objectives. There is also the risk that this could create some backsliding on climate objectives as well. We might be able to be pulling in more renewable and carbon-free power from other states, but that in turn might cause those other states to rely more heavily on their existing fossil fleet. And so while California might race ahead, there are other states that might lag or behind even in more so. And as we all know, the carbon accounting of climate change is a global phenomenon, not just something that stops at our state border. So there's some very real concerns about is this good or bad for decarbonization? And if we move to the next slide, and this is, I believe, my final slide before Mark has a couple. This is just kind of the rundown of who's opposing regionalization. Quite a few other environmental groups for that last concern that I just spoke to. Labor is quite concerned about regionalization, and frankly, the labor opposition was the reason why regionalization did not progress the last time it was advanced in the California legislature. Mark can speak to that a bit more. And then many of the ratepayer advocacy groups, such as TURN, are concerned about this and what it might mean for California's ratepayers. CMUA is another interesting group that has come out in opposition to this. So there is very much division amongst the types of groups that would need to be at the table for this sort of deal to be struck. And they really do seem to boil down to jurisdictional oversight, the opportunities and risks around achieving our climate objectives, the opportunities for increased economies of scale and savings for the rate base versus the balance of in-job creation and fair working wages here in California. So there's a lot of tensions at play in this matter. And I think I can hand the mic to Mark with the next slide.
Planning directors, Mark Hirschman, Director of Fair, provide a little bit of the legislative context. There was a bill introduced some years ago during the Brown administration, and actually this because that bill did not advance despite the full support of that administration. In February of this year, Chris Holden, chair of the Assembly Appropriations Committee, chair of the Assembly Utilities and Energy Commission, introduced AB 538. And to put it in context, AB 538 has a number of key components, but essentially it can be looked at as a framework to expand the ISO Water Mission organization meets the statutory goal necessary to do that by some kind of structure, expanded reasonable geographic area, but it does not dictate the structure that that would take. It leads to ISO and the the California Energy Commission, to KPB, to the UC, to the public and to the legislature, the opportunity to weigh in on this. It includes for the public, it's hearings, it would come back to the legislature for its say on the program that we developed. I think the way of looking at this bill is that it is meant to be at this time a signal to the other agencies in the Western region that would be looking to form a coalition. And thank to them that California is looking forward to participate. If we can go to the next slide. The bill also contains 18 different organizational elements that described, as well as other and issue areas of this transmission siting, GHG reduction policies, but it includes certain public access and information to for the Act 15, so there will essentially the equivalent of Brown Act availability for meetings, public access to records, so on. The Holden bill, AB 538, was heard in the Assembly Utilities and Energy Committee in April and passed by a 12-0 vote with 3 members of the committee not voting. But what was interesting about it was that the members of the committee, for the most part, voiced very strong concerns about the bill. And they raised exactly the issues that Jeremy outlined, the issue of governance, state of California used certain degree of control, as previously pointed out, the governor, the 5 members of ISO, the state senate ratified as members. We would no longer have that. It will be environmental where projects are cited, how moving from one place to another throughout the Western region, and labor the project will be built outside the state of California. The wages paid to the labor and build those projects. Next stop of the bill was the Assembly Appropriations Committee, and it would have been heard in that committee in May, but it was pulled for consideration for it was by appropriation. The chair of that committee, and that's a very powerful place to be, as all this through that committee. So his decision to pull that at that time is interesting. Did not at that time indicate exactly that it would be a 2-year bill. If it was a 2-year bill, it would come back. It would come back next year. It would have to get out of the House. Get out of the Assembly. Get out of the House. January time frame. But so the fact that it didn't indicate exactly that it was a 2-year bill, although it suggested that it is. Also, today that it could come back at any time. So there are numerous processes by which this year. So. Energy use this goal. There has been no indication from the governor that he's going to push AB 538. As soon as the bill was pulled, the very same day, the governor issued a statement indicating that he supports the concept of reaching state, but just that there's support. As I mentioned, when it was heard in the utilities energy, the various groups that you saw proposed position, their concerns. Yeah. Those discussions are ongoing. goals. I think that's about the status of it right now. Any something about-
Jeff,
Yeah, so just intuitively, you could think of kind of a hard regionalization, a soft regionalization. The hard would be what we're talking about, where you create one government structure. And the soft would be something like ISO basically joining Marcus Plus. Where we don't actually change the own structure, become kind of a less formal also. Does this bill kind of have, does 8530 have the latitude for any of those kind of steps? I mean, there's some definition, I mean, you're really just aiming for forming a new organization, or is there an immediate step where we can just sort of partner with this emerging regional organization?
The way 538 is written, it's left to the CDC to review the situation, and I don't know the answer as to whether does leave it to CDC to decide how to adjust that.
Is that an option?
Unknown.
Not even.
It would be all just politically up leading this case, forming a new government structure, but
That's interesting.
Jeremy, did you hear that question?
I was not able to hear that very clearly.
oh, sorry, Jeremy, Jeff, I'll repeat. I was just saying there's kind of, you could imagine kind of a hard regionalization, which is kind of a formal, creation of a new structure, but then even something as less formal as CAISO joining Markets Plus. And I was asking if the bill itself sort of, it sounds like there's some discretion there for all those, for that to happen, but I was curious if anyone's talked about kind of some intermediate step like that, where we WIM were to merge with Markets Plus or have some sort of agreement so that California could still be getting power from outside California, maybe relying more on market forces and governments to achieve our goals.
Yeah, it's a good question. And the WEIM and the EDAM were really formed after the last push for regionalization in the legislature, where in the course of negotiating that and contemplating that, I think the ISO realized there were some market opportunities that they could dip their toe into that could extend outside of the California borders. And that's what enabled those markets to form and to start thriving. I'm not far enough into the politics to understand why there is enough of a market potential for both the Markets Plus and the EDAM, WEIM. Why can't we have just a consolidated energy market? I think an area where there's certainly a lot of concern is not just in the energy market, it's with the capacity market. California currently has its RA program that focuses on California. If there were to be a broader regional effort, would that not include a regional capacity market or capacity framework of some degree, whether or not it's a central market or it's more an RA type program? But the wrap that's being set up by the Southwest Power Pool is a regional RA like program that they're starting to set up that has at least at present looks like less onerous requirements than California's RA program, which is I think a big part of the threat that I think certain advocates for regionalization are seeing, that they will cannibalize a lot of the import capacity as it goes to these markets that are easier to transact in California's capacity markets.
I have a question. So Jeremy, one of the slides which was describing this, I think said that California, and I don't know if it's on this slide or not, California would maintain its decision-making over California-related matters or over, let's see, maintaining, it is this second bullet point, maintaining state authority over state matters related to procurement policy and resource planning. Does that mean that the PUC, right now, I assume that our RA requirement has to be satisfied from within California? Is that?
We can meet some of our RA requirement through importing capacity outside of California, but the RA requirements are established in a combination between what the ISO determines is needed for reliability within its footprint in terms of contracted capacity, and then the CPUC for its jurisdictional entities that in RA's context include us, then takes their share of what the ISO has identified as needed and assigns those obligations onto all the entities that it has authority over. So the investor-owned utilities, and the CCAs and ESPs. So we'd still have to be complying with the rules set up by the CPUC. It may be that if the ISO is moving to a regional effort, the ISO's determination of what's needed may evolve some. But we'd still be answering to the CPUC. That's the way it's contemplated, at least in this bill.
Okay, so just to restate, it sounds like our RA obligations, which have been a tremendous burden for us, and the CPUC, I think, has been extremely difficult in terms of especially their penalties and the way they've managed that whole process. It doesn't sound like that changes with regionalization.
It could, but at least the way it's been framed in this bill, they're tabling that part of what may be negotiated around. There are examples elsewhere in the country of central capacity markets serving a broader footprint of entities, and that kind of model could be considered. California has deliberately steered away from that model for a range of reasons over the years. And one of them being concerns around how a capacity market might interplay with the environmental objectives of the GHG-free procurement targets, the RPS procurement targets that we have as a state. So that's, I think, a part of why they've painted a bright line around this and said we're going to leave the RA market and the CPUC operating the way they are. I think certainly from our perspective, the way the CPUC is operating the RA market is far from perfect right now. And I think we would be open to broader conversations around how could we reimagine the way we handle capacity in RA. But at least this is, again, you know, where the first time regionalization came up, I was talking to a attorney at a law firm who was helping us get up to speed on this issue. This was when I was at MCE, and he described it as the CCAs are really the mice in a room of dancing elephants. We have a very small amount of influence. The scale of what's being contemplated and negotiated around here is quite large. And so just because we might not be so happy with how the CPUC runs RA doesn't necessarily mean our griping over it is enough to get it onto the table for negotiations. But maybe if we're willing to support the effort in other ways and willing to help address some of the broader key points of negotiation elsewhere, that's part of I think that is perhaps why MCE has been so bullish about supporting regionalization, is that they really want to be at the table, helping them negotiate over the breadth of parameters that need to be contemplated in this effort.
And that was gonna be my question, is why then CE they've actually dove into this really quickly, supportless. Do you feel like we need to take a position on this, or that we can just sort of sit back and be reactive? What's the staff's suggestion or framework on this?
Well, that's why we wanted to bring this to you, because I think it would be to our benefit to take a position. And I think from a resources position, we are more in favor of it. That it would, we see a lot of benefits for us. So we just wanted, that's partly why we brought it to you today, just kind of as a study session. We will bring it to the full board as well as a study session. Elliot Mainzer, the CEO of the ISO, is happy to come and address the board as well. So we'll plan to have that happen, and he can give you more insight on this. But he did make a presentation to the Cal CCA board. And after that, it's like, whoa, we need to like get on the stick here and really figure out what we're gonna do. But it's very political. I mean, and Jeremy said it, the governor appoints the ISO board, so it's very political, and that's, I think the governance issues really, as well as some of the others that are opposing it, like labor, have to be addressed. Thing is, and from my perspective regarding labor, these projects need to be built anyway. They're gonna be built in California, they're gonna be built outside of California. There's just a huge need for generation. And the fact that we might be contracting for something out of state doesn't reduce the need for additional in-state resources. So I don't think it's going to hurt labor. I think it's gonna make all those goals, you know, it's the rising tide that will really help everyone with jobs. It's not just.
If you're sort of sitting insular, outing in your own little neighborhood, you don't have a lot of influence on that. Or if you get to the table, then you can, you know, suggest labor standards and hopefully persuade other states and maybe right to work states of why this is important. And when you don't have a seat at the table, no.
The reason that I asked the question about RA is just, I can see there's pluses and minuses. I mean, the risk is the loss of state control, particularly around decarbonization issues, and the increase of the power mix with coal generated power, which we currently almost have zero of in California. But I also see the strength of having more access to power and making that transmission of power more fluid and easier. But I feel like one of the huge problems in the energy market in California is the controls CPUC has, which is extremely tied to the IOUs, and it's a carryover of the legacy IOU monopoly world. By those who are charged with regulating them, and to the extent they lose some regulation, they lose some work, and therefore they resist those changes. And I think that has adversely impacted us to a great degree in the place that I mean, in the past, I've been mostly focused on the PCIA and the way that that was managed and its adverse impact on us. And right now, I'm focused on RA and the way that their policies around that adversely impact us. So if there's any ability to, and I'm not saying PCE has much say in this, but maybe Cal CCA has more, to the extent that we can influence to get some benefit at the RA side by at least satisfying some of our RA requirements with power resources that are more coming from out of state, you know, in a reorganized solution than we have right now, that would be in our benefit. Without that, it's less interesting, but that maybe we have some leverage to kind of get a win there that would make it more interesting. Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, the argument for regionalization frankly is Texas, which is both politically and physically an island, and it's kind of a train wreck, both in terms of reliability and actually in terms of economics. And so it's like, we become sort of, I think our market is probably as large as the rest of the Western states combined. So if we're looking for certain procurement goals, we will have some impact. And more wind projects we build in the Rockies because we are part of that, if we become part of that network. And so it's it's definitely something where I think engaging in this gives us, I mean, we have a huge market influence. It's not illegal, it's not governance out leverage, but it's market leverage.
There you go, let's comment on that too, which is potentially trying to persuade them, maybe we'll never get this, but, you know, like more of a weighted representation. As opposed to just, you know, Senate, you go to Congress instead, you know, and that's more a weighted representation by per capita or something. And try to push attention, so we have. And then the second thing is, again, you know, decarbonizing just the state of California, while the rest of the United States continues to not, is not. So if we get, you know, strong administration, we have strong leadership in the Senate, in Congress, in the White House, who support this, being a leader and helping take the lead on and working throughout the rest of the country is probably ultimately for America. Good. And I mean, we can, you know, we can't just operate always as the state of California and I like Texas, it's like, let's not be Texas, let's be California and be leaders.
So I have what is an alternative to this? So if you look at the Economist, McKinsey, US map, and you see that as a state, we're importing anywhere from 40 to 51% of all of our electricity. It's a huge hurdle to get actually produce it internally in the next, whatever, 30, in the next 10 years. I mean, it seems to me that we have to look at some sort of regionalization, but is there an alternative to that could allow the state to, produce the electricity it needs? And the second comment is just an observation that going into the Southwest power pool will make the decisions far more conservative because of the states that dominate. Let's make that really clear. These are coal states, right? These are states that generally tend to be somewhat climate deniers, right? So it will affect, I think, the policies that come out of it, and whether it's labor or whether it's how fast we have to decarbonize. I think we have to go into that eyes wide open. We will probably not be, they will probably not generate as progressive or cutting edge policies. But is there an alternative, Jeremy, to not doing the regional that gets us out of like 50%? That's
Texas.
Jeremy.
Did you hear that, Jeremy?
Yeah, I think so. A couple slides back, that 86 gigawatts of new generation capacity that have to be built. If we just presume that gets done, that will happen one way or the other. If it's all sited within California or it's balanced between being sited in California and elsewhere, I think those are very different economic outcomes. We know how much of a premium California land has, and we have been heavily developing renewable energy in California already. So a lot of the low-hanging fruit sites have already been acted upon. And it's not to say there aren't still opportunities out there, but especially if we look to certain resources that are really tied to certain geographic constraints, like geothermal as an example, it's a pretty short list of where more of that could be sited in California. So I think there's very real economic differences between whether we try to do this all through kind of a Texas islanded model or through broader regional effort. I think the economics are generally make a strong case for the value of regionalizing. The politics are what tempers it. And I was having a little sidebar with a colleague here where if we bring, say, states like Wyoming into the mix in a regionalized effort, could this actually help to accelerate the economics to encourage them to use more renewable sourced energy as more and more of it gets built within their state, potentially. But at the same time, in the governance structure, if every seat on the board for the regionalized effort is 1 seat per state that participates, then that, you know, Wyoming representative carries as much weight potentially as the California representative. And what could that mean in terms of gamesmanship and politics? You know, if that representative comes from a state that already has some very deep ties into the oil and gas industry and is perhaps advocating on their interests much more so than any, you know, ISO representative presently would here in California. It's a challenge. Like we would likely be committing ourselves to some bumpy near-term years ahead as this entity gets set up and as the politics of it gets sorted out for the longer-term economic gains that I think that could become brought about by it, and potential climate gains as well.
Jeremy, has there been any discussion, as Donna noted, having the representation be by load or by population?
It's certainly been talked about. I think there's a logic there for sure. The challenge is that if a regionalized effort like this forms, if California proceeds with authorizing the ISO and the state to contemplate establishing a regional entity, that still doesn't guarantee that other states participate. And so if the governance structure is a little too biased towards California getting the veto vote on everything, let's say, just by load share alone, other states say, thanks, no thanks, but I'd rather participate in the Southwest Power Pool's offerings rather than the ISO offerings.
Jose and Santa Clara County, where everyone is going to be wary of us and for the. Well, I think it's like 100 times the size of Wyoming's power. So if Wyoming is not going to agree to have 100 California votes for this.
Okay, so let me just see if there's any public comments. See any public comment? We're past our time. So thanks to the staff for bringing this up. This is obviously important. And we can all think about it and participate in the board. So. Okay, the last item.
Sorry, I was just going to say
Yeah.
thank you for the robust discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy.
So the last item on the agenda is committee member.
Just resource management and climate protection committee meetings, we began talking about another trip to FIFO. So I think we have enough new board members and new people who need to go the first time, and with all this especially going on, it could be a really timely trip up. So I just put it out there, and I think we're coordinating, or we're working out.
Yeah, when Donna raised it to me, I said, well, you know, we never went back to right, but we went for the pickup, and if we could stop it right on the way to the CAISO, might be a nice thing to do. It's on the way. It's going to Bolton. CAISO's Bolton.
No. You need to live in Central Valley. Yes, yeah, we were on the phone with some people and they said, oh gosh, anytime you want to come back and do a tour.
Yeah, we did.
We could do like maybe take off at noon, do an afternoon there, spend the night up there or something. It's gonna be back here. If people want to do it overnight. Or we could do two.
That just shows me. Not that far.
Yeah. Thanks, Jimmy. Did it follow up on that one? I will circle back if you don't. Okay.
Okay. Everybody, that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.